Here, this document. Let's see, is this the right one? Yeah, this is part two. Okay, you can all see that, right?
Yes.
All right. So, so as I said before, this information is extracted directly from your textbook. So you'll see at the end of every page, there'll be references to the page number as well as the topic of discussion. So that way you can find that and look at it on your own. And what this is talking about primarily is this speaks directly to apologetics because these excerpts are taken from those areas that are in controversy. And so many critics take pot shots at the Bible and say, okay, that's not real because we don't see a historical record of that. And so therefore, how can you stand on this? Because it's just a story. And many people feel like the Bible is just a bunch of stories put together and that they were made up along the way and they have no truth in them or factual evidence. But we can know from archaeology that archaeology aligns itself along with the historical record, even whether it be a biblical record or a secular record, it aligns itself with dates and times and people and places and all of that. And so that's what these extractions are all about, are about that very thing. And so they are not numbered in any particular order, except for the fact that these numbers point to these references at the bottom of each page. So that's why they're not referenced sequentially, and but they are ascending in order. They are ascending in order. So there is a reference in the book of Judges in chapter 9 talking about man named Abimelech and how he had burned the Shechemite temple. And so that's pointed out in scripture, but many people, many critics, um, differed in opinion about whether that really happened or not. But we find confirmation in this because excavations were done and those buildings, those temples, portions of the ruins of them were discovered in a place called Berith, and we find pottery evidence of that particular temple that was there, and we can use the pottery as we saw so many times in our textbook that pottery was one of the main ways in which we were able to date periods of time. Um, Hold on a second. Somebody's coming back to class. Let me see who this is. Find out who it is. Stop the share for a moment and go to here. All right. So there were excavations done and pottery was found that uh, proved that this temple was real and that it was destroyed. And they put the date around 1300 BC, and they know that it was burned about 150 years later. About 150 years later, they found evidence of that. So we know that that particular event was real, that it actually happened. The Bible attests to it, and it's now proven by archaeology finds and artifacts and that kind of thing. Um, just like there was a place called the Pool of Gibeon, and that's in Second Samuel. Once again, we find that critics said the pool didn't exist, and it didn't exist in David's time. And this was a time when, as you know, David and Saul were at odds, which they were for most of their lives, that Saul was chasing David all around. And they found evidence of this pool when they did excavations at this place called Gibeon. Today it's called El Jib, and it revealed this large pool of water, just like it was reported in the Bible, and the scholars were able to identify it. And they, even though it was considered to be such a small detail, in reality, it was not a small detail. It was another biblical find that proved that the events of the Bible are true, just like it said it was true. One of the things that I found very disturbing was that there are critics who don't necessarily believe that David organized many choirs and musicians during his day. He was a musician himself, as we all know. He played for Saul. But it has been proven that he was. So I find it difficult because when you have the whole book of Psalms and you find out that David wrote most of those Psalms, and most of those Psalms are then attributed to a musical score, and it can actually be played with musical instruments. People wanted to take credit from David and said, no, he never did anything like that. It was impossible for him to do that. And they didn't find records of that until way much later. But critics are always standing firm on what they don't believe. They stand less firm on what they do believe, but they always stand firm about what they don't believe, and they will take shots at the Bible every time. So we find that there was a vase that was discovered in a place called Megiddo that shows information that David was actually the one who formed and organized these choirs, these singers and players of musical instruments. They found scenes of banquets that had occurred, and they found pictorial graphic information in Egypt showing that this was true. And that's why it was so important that we take a look at the early forms of writing, such as hieroglyphics and cuneiform, because all of these things were used to record history at that time on walls of tombs and in temples and places like that. And so once they were able to discover how to interpret the hieroglyphics, then it became more real for them that what was reported in the Bible was actually true. It was actually true. They even found evidence of this in a place called Ur, which we talked about early on, which is close to the Persian Gulf, which is probably near the very physical location of the Garden of Eden. So we find evidence of that as well. And we refer to this area as the Mesopotamia, or otherwise known as the Fertile Crescent. So we find evidence of all of that kind of thing. So we find that this is true even to the point of being, to the point of happening 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. It was in the time of David. So we find all of these things, and therefore we can attribute those writings in the book of Psalms to David exactly like the Bible says that they happened. So all of that corroborates the truth from the biblical record. There was one other thing. Yeah, so the other thing was that they also found evidence of these actual musical instruments as well, such as the lyre, which was similar to a harp. They found evidence of this, and even to the point of finding an oboe. And I don't know if you all know what an oboe is, if you're familiar with musical instruments. A very nice sounding instrument. It's akin to the flute in many ways, but it has a much richer and deeper sound. But they found actual evidence of oboes and lyres, which is similar to a harp or maybe even a violin in some cases. So all of this was evidence of the existence of these choirs and these orchestras that David had formed and that he had guided using the music and the writings that came from the Psalms, So we all know that David was king at one time, and there was a Davidic empire, an empire that was ruled by David. And we find evidence of this in Second Samuel chapter 8 and also First Chronicles 18. We find evidence of that, which it proves that David ruled over various cities in his empire, one by the name of Zobah. Zobah, and at one time they didn't believe that Zobah was included in a part of David's empire. But it was included just like Galilee was included. And it was right around Damascus, just north of that. And they thought initially it was south of that, but they have proven different from that when they did their excavations. And so it really, once again, goes back to proof of showing that David was not only king, but that he had an empire, and that empire had many, many different locations included in that empire. It was, a king had complete rule over his empire. It wasn't a democracy, or anything like that. What the king said went, and that was it. What he didn't say, it didn't go. So nobody could stand up against the king without threat of being put in jail or even hung or killed in some way. But here, this next excerpt about Solomon stands in contention even to this day. So where First Kings 9 talks about Solomon's stables, and this is where the disagreement comes in place. So when you read about Solomon's stables in the Bible, it talks about him having 40,000 stables. But what they found out was that was probably misinterpreted somewhere during one of the translations. It was misinterpreted, and it should have been 4,000 instead of 40,000. So he did not have 40,000 stables. It was more like 4,000 stables. And they found evidence of the housing of his 450 horses that he had during his reign. They found that when they did excavations in that area, and archaeology was able to prove that out, that Solomon did have the possessions that the Bible says that he had, including all of his stables. And his stables during that day were worth a lot of money, and it would be worth a lot of money even to this day. So once again, we find that to be true. When we take a look at the kings of Israel, and we know that when the Israelites were divided, there were actually two kingdoms. The kingdom called Israel and the kingdom called Judah. They were separated. And so what we had was 10 tribes in Israel and 2 tribes in Judah, which made up the 12 tribes. And they separated when Solomon became king in Judah. That pointed to the separation. And then after that, we began to have different kings of Israel and different kings of Judah as we went down through time. And so we find that the first king of Israel was a person by the name of Jeroboam. And we read about that in First Kings. And when we read about Jeroboam, we find that once again, critics took offense to that, and they said, no, Jeroboam wasn't actually a person who lived, but there's a thing called the seal, which is right here, the seal of Megiddo. And once again, a seal is nothing but like a cylinder, and it has inscriptions on it, some made of stone, some made of other metal materials, and inscriptions were engraved on them about various kings that were in rulership, various wars that took place, all types of things were on these seals. And so there was a seal of Megiddo, and there was also seals that were used to authenticate documents. So if there was a letter or a law that was put out by the king, that king would then use the seal on his ring in order to dip it in wax and stamp it on that letter or that document to show where it came from, that it was authentic, that it came from the king during that time. So there was a seal of Megiddo was found bearing the title of Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. And so if you got a servant of Jeroboam, then Jeroboam must have been a real person. And so there was also a couple different Jeroboams, Jeroboam the first, and then there was the second, both of which were real. And the seal, once again, bears out that record that there was an official by that name in Israel. So we know that Jeroboam was a real person, and they have evidence of that person existing. And so as we go through all these excerpts, we find that time and time again, there's evidence in the archaeological record that proves that these people, that these events actually took place. And so when we take a look at various wars that took place, there was an attack on Jerusalem by a person by the name of Shishak. And we find that there was a record of Shishak coming from Egypt to attack Israel. And there's an inscription on the walls of Karnak, as it's called, which confirms that account. And these inscriptions, they depict what is happening in captives being taken from the Israelites, and their bodies that they discovered all bear the name of these Palestinian towns. And so, and if we put a pin in it right there, that's why we have this problem that we have today with Israel and Palestine. For you see, at one time, Jerusalem was referred to as Palestine instead of being referred to as Jerusalem. And so you find this ongoing war about who's supposed to have possession of what territories. And that war will go on until Jesus returns. It's not going to end. I don't care how many peace talks they have. I don't care how many prisoners they release. That war is going to continue because it is not a war like we think of normal wars where you get some country doesn't like some other country and they want to attack that country and destroy it. It's not about that. It's a holy war, and it goes back as far as time goes back, and that war will continue on. So we find that in this particular event, there was an inscription talked about captives being taken from Palestinian towns. So, and this was caused by an attack that was launched by a person by the name of Shishak, which came from Egypt. Then you had the sixth king of Israel, which was called Omri. Omri was the sixth king. And in those days, the capital of Israel was Samaria. And they found evidence of Omri. Once they did excavations, they found evidence of that. And they also found evidence that confirmed the kingship of this Sumerian capital by the name of Omri. So they found evidence of that in pottery and seals and the like. And also, they found it on this thing called a black obelisk. And this was another type of seal, and it had inscriptions on it. And it depicted a person by the name of Jehu, which was the son of Omri, the king of Israel. And they showed him paying tribute to the king of Assyria. And Assyria had taken captive parts of Israel at one particular point in time. And so this king was Omri, and his son was Jehu. So we all know who Ahab was, and many people believe that Ahab was fictitious. But once again, archaeologists, they were able to excavate Samaria and discovered a palace. the ruins of a palace, which was 315 feet from north to south. And so they found the remains of that palace that dated back to Ahab's time, and it showed evidence of the walls faced with limestone, and they found ivory decorations on that wall. And so they found all of this evidence to prove that Ahab's palace actually existed, and there should be no doubt about it. So many of these things shut down the critics, but as you know, critics will stand again and they will take pot shots at something else to say that it's not real and that the biblical record is in error. So we find all of these things right as excerpts right out of our textbook. So those are there for your reference. We talked about this before, which was the Isaiah manuscript. We talked about that when we were talking about the origin of the Bible. And even today, there is a copy of the Isaiah scroll written in Hebrew that stands in Jerusalem right now. And if you were able to read Hebrew, you would find out that it's almost a word-for-word match to the book of Isaiah that we have in our King James Bible. So, so there's no doubt about it that Isaiah was a real person, that he was a prophet, and that he lived during a period of about 750 BC, sometime around there. But this all came about to become real when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in about 1947. And I don't know if any of you know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how valuable they were to the biblical record, but it happened as though two young boys over in the area near the Dead Sea were chasing some goats that had gotten away. And the goats ran into a cave, and they began to throw rocks in this cave to try to make them come out. And when they threw the rocks in the cave, they found out that the rocks hit something, and they didn't know what it was because it didn't sound like a wall. It sounded like glass breaking. And so they went into the cave to investigate to find out what it was. And what they found was there were these large vases, as we might call them today, or large pots that stood erect, and they had inside of them, they had scrolls inside of them, ancient scrolls. And many of these ancient scrolls are some of the oldest copies of the original manuscripts that we have today. And so when they didn't know what they had found, but they knew they were worth something because they were scrolls, but they didn't know exactly what it was and what it said. So what they did, what the two boys did, was, of course, try to sell them. And somebody found out about it, and they knew what it was, and they bought them for little or nothing. And then they went on and they sold them to somebody else and made a ton of money off of them. And eventually, I believe it was the British Museum. I'm not exactly sure right now, but I believe it was the British Museum who got a hold of these scrolls, and that's where they're kept. And so what they had discovered was that many of these documents that they had found were on papyrus. Some were on pieces of hardened clay, and they took a bunch of scholars and archaeologists and they put all these pieces back together. There were hundreds of fragments because a lot of it over time had broken down, but they were able to put it together and to determine what the original said. So it took a lot of years for that to happen, but once it did happen, they have these scrolls, these Dead Sea Scrolls, on display in the museum where you can actually go look at them. So they proved to be very, very valuable. And because they were near the Dead Sea, which is a very arid, dry place, it preserved these documents that were on papyrus. Had it been any other place, they would have probably crumbled and dissolved. but because of where they were located, they were preserved. And so what had happened was there was a group of people called the Essenes, who were like monks, basically. And it was a time at which Jerusalem was being overrun by the Roman Empire. They were destroying it sometime around AD 70 or thereabouts. So they knew about it beforehand and they wanted to preserve the biblical record. So they hid all these scrolls in these big jars and stored them in a cave where they thought nobody would ever find them in there. And it just so happens, uh, in the fullness of time, God revealed these scrolls through what the boys thought was an accident, which we know now was not an accident, but God revealed himself. Because you remember, from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament was about 400 years. And we refer to those 400 years as the silent years, a time in which there were no prophets that were speaking the word of God to the people of God. And so this preservation of God's word in these caves was very, very important and very, very valuable that they were preserved. And so this group of monks were actually the ones who were able to maintain this biblical record at that time. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we found out when we were talking about the origin of the Bible, we find out that when those Dead Sea Scrolls became available, then many of the translations that we had today, some of them were revised because they said, oh, now we have another source to prove the biblical record, and we want to make sure that what we have in our translation matches that as close as possible. So they went back to these manuscripts that are called the Dead Sea Scrolls and compared what they had in their translations with the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts to make sure that they were accurate. And if there needed to be any changes, then they would make those changes in the later translations. And so that was one of the early sources of the translations that we have of the Bible today. So it was very, very valuable. So you will hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls again. So just keep that in mind. So we'll be talking about that in more detail. Uh, so once again, when we look at this Isaiah scroll, we find out that there are only minor differences in that Isaiah scroll that stands in Jerusalem as compared to the Bibles that we have today. There are only minor differences, and most of it has to do with dialect, the pronunciation of words in the Old Testament versus words in the New Testament. You know, like sometimes you'll read the Old Testament and it will say Isaiah, and then when you see that talked about in the New Testament, it might say Isaias instead of Isaiah. So you'll find differences like that in the spelling of some of the names, in the pronunciation of some of the names. You'll find those kind of differences. So those are the kind of differences that we're talking about. We're not talking about differences in principle or content. We're just talking about interpretations and spellings and those kinds of things. So then we have a person by the name of Sargon, and Sargon's army was the Assyrians, and the Assyrians came against a place called Ashdod, which was a Philistine city. And records of Sargon is confirmed in Assyria and how they came against Ashdod. So once again, when excavations were done in that area, it really proved that the Philistines were a real people. Sargon was a real people. The Assyrian army was a real army. All of these were bore out in the biblical record through excavation and findings, artifacts that were found during these excavations. And then we find about this person by the name of Sennacherib, and Sennacherib died, and he talked about he died at the hands of his own sons. And there is an Assyrian inscription that verifies this report, and it talks about how his sons forsook the gods and they killed their father. A lot of that's going on today, isn't it? Sons killing fathers, fathers killing sons.
Yeah.
Well, in biblical times, it was happening as well, and there is a record of it. It came from excavations that were done in Assyria, and they found these inscriptions that prove that Sennacherib was a real person, that his sons were real, and they actually killed him. Um, and we find that there is a king by the name of Jehoiachin. Now we switch over to kings of Judah. Well, first, we talked about kings of Israel, but there was also evidence of the kings of Judah being real people by their names, by their locations. So the archaeology evidence is there that this person actually reigned. Um, and they found stamped jar handles with writings on them that showed that this person was real. However, we find that the names were spelled differently. So Jehoiachin was actually a shortened version of Yokin. And so Yokin and Jehoiachin are the same as was discovered later on. And so we find that on these clay jars, these names inscribed there. So then experts began to understand that these were real people and they actually lived. And it was during the Babylonian exile that they actually existed. So once again, we have proof of that. We have one of my favorite people, Nebuchadnezzar. And so we know Nebuchadnezzar, uh, he wanted to rule the entire world. That was his chosen destiny. That's what he wanted to do, rule the whole world. And so we find that he stood head and shoulders over Babylon, and we know that Babylon was a real place. And today Babylon is known as Iraq. That's what the same location, approximately the same size. We find inscriptions that were unearthed when they did an excavation of a Babylonian tell, and we know what a tell is, right? From builders and projects, and there were temples and there were bricks that were taken that actually had Nebuchadnezzar's name on it. So we know that because of that excavation, that Nebuchadnezzar was a real person, was a real person. And as I had said early on when we were first introducing archaeology, I told you that Nebuchadnezzar, he had a direct descendant, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and in many ways he acted just like him. He wanted to rule the world as well. Uh, didn't make it to that point, but he wanted to do that. He set out to do it. Um, And we also find that the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about the fragments thereof prove that Daniel was a real person and that his writings were real. We find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, and we find that there was a form of lettering very similar to the ancient Isaiah manuscript. And it has suggested that it was 100 years before the birth of Christ. And so the text is essentially the same as the Hebrew text, just like we find with the book of Isaiah. So we know that these ancient prophets, that they were real people. So the rest of this, I'm going to leave to you. There's not very much more of it, but you'll find that there's evidence upon evidence that all of these biblical records are true. They align themselves with the historical record. We find that case after case after case. And as I said, you might want to pull up these excerpts from the classroom. There's two of them, the part one and the part two, and just look through them. Especially be familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because as I said before, you will see that again. Um, and you might see some other excerpts as well. Um, so, any questions about anything that we've covered thus far?
No, I don't have any.
All right, so I'm going to stop the share. All right. So, the next topic I wanted to talk about is DNA. Does anybody know what DNA stands for? Those three letters.
Something diagnostic nationality or something. Somebody just had a discussion a couple of weeks ago. Um,
Mm. I
DNA.
sent for my DNA analysis through Ancestry.
Oh, you
One
did
of
it?
those places. So in about a few more weeks, I know from which I came.
mm,
Well, I'm gonna look
back.
on there and see if we related. So
Yeah, it could be. Could be. You know, God does things so miraculous. I was at a food giveaway today, and somebody left their phone. So I scrolled through the phone, so they didn't have a lock on it, and I found the person's name. And then I said, well, maybe I know somebody that's in their contact. And
right.
Lord and behold, my God sister's name was there. And just as I was getting ready to call her to find out who the lady was, the lady
Right.
came back for her phone, and then I told, she said, "Oh yeah, she's one of my missionary sisters." I said, "Look how small this world is."
It's a small world. It's
Yeah.
so small. It's so small. I run into people a lot. And, you know how it is, and you see somebody, you say, "Gosh, I know you from somewhere. Don't know
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
where, but I know you from somewhere." And they said,
Mhm.
"Well," and then you start sharing information, and you find out, "Oh, we cross paths here." And you say,
Mhm.
"Okay, well, who do you know, and who do you know?" And you find that
Mhm.
sometimes you find out you're related, and sometimes you find out, oh, they know a person who knows a person who knows you.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
It's
and,
amazing.
and so when you get your DNA back, they're gonna in the ancestry they have a section in there called DNA match. And
Mhm.
when you go in there, everybody who submitted their DNA to ancestry, it'll show you whether you're a match or not. And then
Mhm.
it'll show you whether you are first cousin or no. It'll show you whether you're a sibling or first cousin or second
Oh
cousin,
wow.
whether that person is your mother or your father.
Oh wow.
Yeah, right. And it gets down to the point where it shows you if you find a person, which side of the family they're on, whether they're
Mm,
on your father's side or whether they're on your mother's side. So you know
Mhm.
that, and then you can actually build a family tree while you're in Ancestry, and then you can share your family tree if you want to, so that others can, they can add to it or they can see it and view it, like that. So, I found out so many things, because like I tell people all the time, the only thing you know is what people tell you.
Tell you. That's
Right.
right. That's right.
Until you find out some real scientific information that shows that, yes, this is who your father was, or this is who your mother was, you find that out. And I've had people call me now on the phone, and they say, oh, because I'll put notes out there and say, hey, I'll sh share notes with people who are a match with me. And I said, hey, somehow we're related. If you want to talk about it, please email me, and I'll give them an email address. And people have contacted me. And so
mm,
I ran into a person who uh, I didn't know, but we had a match on Ancestry, and we began to talk about it. And I said, okay, sounds like you're on my mother's side, but they didn't know who their father was, and they
Mhm.
said, well, I'm searching for my father. And I said, well, I'll see what's on my side and see if I can find out
Oh
some things. And
wow.
in the midst of it, we started talking and throwing names out, and she threw a name out, and I said, oh, I said, I know that person. And he said, you do? And I said, where is that person? He said, well, person is a close friend of mine and lives in Atlanta, Georgia. And I said, Atlanta, Georgia. I said, I haven't seen this person in 40 years. I said, the
Mm.
Wow.
last time I saw them was in Detroit, and I thought they were in Detroit, and I was looking for them, and I couldn't find them, you know? And then it comes to the point where I had their last name wrong, right? I thought their last name was what did I think it was? Their last name ended up being Bruce, and I thought it was something else. I thought it was Britton or Breton like that, but it was Bruce, and that's why I couldn't find them. And then, so 40 years later, I find a person. She gives me the number. I call him, and he says, "I've been looking for you for 40 years." And I said, "I've been looking for you for 40 years." It was so
That's all
funny.
right.
It
Yeah.
was so funny because he said, "Did you know that you have a whole nother branch of your family that you never met?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, yeah, it's a whole nother clan." What do you mean a clan? He said, a whole nother bunch of people. And I was like, "Okay, can I meet them?" And then we had a Zoom call, and we were able to share some information. Then I discovered that there was a document that gave the whole lineage of my family on my
Wow.
mother's side, which went all the way back to 1835.
Wow.
Wow.
1835. And I was like, oh my God. So
Hmm.
then I found out that what I thought my name was really wasn't what my name was. So
Okay.
Oh, I got a lot to look for because my mother was her only child, and her mother died when she was 12 or 13. So I don't know anything about her side of the family. She had one cousin that lived here in Baltimore, and she used to come visit her, and she had tons of children. I don't know none of them. So it's gonna be interesting. I started my tree, but I set it up, but I haven't had time to really dive into because I
yeah,
wanted.
oh yeah, oh yeah.
Hmm.
Takes a lot of searching.
Yeah,
You make
yeah,
because many people have the same name, live in a different place, and you got to make sure you
yeah,
got the right person and the
yeah.
right date, and the census. You got to look at the census record and find
Hmm.
out if it's really shown up in the census, and just about everything shows up in the census record. And they update the census record. So, maybe they had somebody's name wrong, or maybe they thought a person was a male versus a female and they got it wrong, and they'll go back there and they'll make edits to the census record to show you, okay, that was wrong, and here's the good stuff, and I'm seeing that a little bit more now after the latest census got released, which was the 1950 census. So the census record isn't released until 72 years later after it's done.
Wow.
Hmm.
Right? So the 1950 census record just got released in 2022. So they don't put it out there because they want to protect the privacy of people. So if they do a census, like let's say they do one today,
Hmm.
they're not going to release it tomorrow, because if they did, then all of these people who are, stalkers and all that kind of stuff would use that to their own benefit.
Hmm.
So they
Oh.
keep it private for 72 years,
Wow.
and then they make it public after that. So all of those people who, let's say, were born in 1950, like myself, then you would find you in the census record if your parents answered the census. And many black folk, our parents didn't answer no census because they were afraid that somebody might be looking for them. So they didn't. So when some census taker came to the door and said, "We're taking the census," they're like, "I'm not home."
They slammed the door. Yeah.
I'm not home.
Mhm.
So, or you hear a little child in the background, "My mommy says she's not home." So many times that you got gaps in there that didn't get recorded. But I found out that, my father, who I thought was my father, was only my stepfather. And then I found out I had another stepfather who wasn't my biological father. So I don't know who my biological father is.
Mm.
So And when I was born, my last name was Tony, right, instead of Franks, and it didn't get legally changed until I was 15 years old that it was
Oh,
legal.
wow.
So I never went by the name of Tony, I all went by the name of Franks, but that's because I didn't know any better. So then I come to find out that it was actually Tony, and then I found out that that wasn't really the name I was born under. I was born under the name of Wilson. So, because that was really my mother's maiden name, so I was Robert Wilson Tony Frank. So so when if you go to work for the government, they ask you, please identify all your aliases. I
That
can't.
you know of.
Mhm.
I can't
I'll
do it.
plead the fifth on that.
I have to plead the fifth because I don't know.
Right. Well, that's true.
Chalk it up to my ignorance. I don't know. So, but all those, I mean, you discover so much about yourself through the
I'm
DNA
excited
match. Oh
until
my
when
God.
school, yeah, when school ends to really get back into that. By that time, well, a couple weeks after that, I should have my DNA and actually go back and start
Yeah.
tracking stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Start doing the matching, and it's just amazing. And I had another guy call me from Texas, and he said, "Looks like we're third cousins." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, who's your mother? Who's your father? All that kind of stuff." And we start tracking back, and then I come to find out that his grandmother was my mother's sister.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
like, okay. I said, okay, who was his sister? I'm like, I never met her, but I did see her
Oh.
name. I did see her name in the census. I saw that my mother had two sisters, but I never met either one of them. But come to find out, his grandmother was my mother's sister. And I'm like, okay, so so who are you really? And then he started telling me about his family and all the branches of his family, which I don't know any of them. So I got a whole nother clan of cousins that I never ever met in my life. So it's
Mm.
like, oh my God. I'm like, so it goes on and on. But back to the original question, what does DNA mean?
I can't pronounce it. Um,
Give it a shot.
oh, deoxyribonucleic
So you just start with the first part of it. You got the first part of it,
deo
deoxy,
deoxyribonucleic
ribonucleic, nuclear,
nucleic
yes, acid,
acid.
yeah.
Hmm.
So
National Human Genome.
yes,
Ge-
yeah. What it
Okay.
what it means is uh it's the chain of life. I'll put it that
Okay.
way. It's the chain of life. Because everybody and every living thing has DNA,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
and it identifies you specifically. I mean, that's why DNA match is so very, very important because it you can't dispute it.
Right.
When the DNA says this is who you are, that's who you are. And if it says this is who this person is, that's who they are. And if there are matches any kind of way, then it says, okay, you two are related because the DNA proves it out. And the DNA is our innermost being, and that's why we refer to it as the chain of life. And the DNA cells that make it up are always replicating themselves, right? Your cells are already always reproducing themselves,
Reproducing.
always. And every cell has in it in its nucleus the DNA as in its nucleus. And so that's why DNA becomes so very important when it comes down to forensics, trying to figure out what happened and when did it happen and to whom did it happen. That's why that forensic trail is so very, very important. And so now archaeologists, and as I said, and I'll say it again, archaeology is a new science. And so they haven't even begun to fathom all of the tools and all of the things that they can use to discover what's related to what and what is a, ancient record that proves itself over time. They haven't even begun to do that because now all of these modern tools that we have are becoming very, very prominent and very, very useful in determining how we trace ancestry, how we trace the history of something, especially when it comes down to living beings, whether they be plant, animal, or human, no matter what it is, we can use DNA to kind of show the relationship from one thing to the next. And so that's how we know that we're not related to apes, okay? No matter what people say, right? The DNA proves it out. We're
That's
different.
right.
We're
That's
different,
right.
so proves it out in every case. And they can't trace DNA back to an amoeba and says, oh, yeah, we were this one cell animal and then we became some sea creature and then we came up out of the sea and then we grew a tail and then we stood up on two legs and yeah, right. Take more faith to believe that than just to believe that
Mhm.
God made us in his own image. So,
And how about the biggest one? The world that started was a big boom, and
sure.
everything existed. You
Yeah,
got your fingerprints, your footprints, all of
yeah.
that. It just
It
existed
just
all back.
happened. It just happened. And and I always let people know it might have been a big boom that happened. Doesn't say that God couldn't cause an explosion, but when he did, he didn't cause chaos when he did that.
That's right.
That's right.
Everything was put in order. It was everything. The stars were hung, the sun were hung, the moon was hung. Everything was put in order. It wasn't chaos.
Hmm.
You blow up something now and see what you get. You're gonna end up
Yes.
with one, you're gonna end up with chaos. Two, you're gonna be in jail. So no, it's not just gonna come. Order does not come out of chaos.
Hmm.
It takes human design. I mean to say not human. It takes an engineering design process to put things in order, to make things make sense. There's a design. Everything we do, everything that I don't care what it is that we touch in this world has a design behind it. It didn't just happen through osmosis. It didn't just happen because some explosion happened and all these things came into order. That's just crazy. It's just crazy. It didn't happen that way. And um, so that's why DNA is so very important. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video. Hopefully this works. Let me go in the classroom for a moment and make sure that I still have it there. I'm gonna pretty sure that I have that somewhere. Maybe I should look on my hard drive. That's where I should look. Okay, so archaeology, and in there we have. Uh, oh yeah, here we go. Let's see. Let's see if that's still where it should be.
Showing up on the first page of Google might not be the best for everyone, but for business.
Stated clearly presents what is DNA?
Okay, so let's see if we can share this. Okay, so here we go. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't do something. I didn't share the sound. Let me stop that. There we go. Okay. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Stated Clearly presents What is DNA and how does it work? DNA, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid, is a molecule. It's a bunch of atoms stuck together. In the case of DNA, these atoms combine to form the shape of a long, spiraling ladder, sort of like this one here. If you ever studied biology or saw the movie Jurassic Park, you probably heard that DNA acts as a blueprint or a recipe for a living thing. But how? How on earth can a mere molecule act as a blueprint for something as complex and wonderful as a tree, a dog, or a dinosaur? To help answer that question, let's first take a quick look at amino acids. Amino acids are tiny little chemicals inside our bodies that are so important, they're often referred to as the building blocks of life. There's about 20 different kinds, each with their own unique shape. The neat thing about them is they can be attached to each other kind of like Legos to produce an endless variety of larger particles known as proteins. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins, along with other chemicals, combine to form living cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. And organs, when they're all put together and functioning, of course, combine to form living creatures like you and me. These proteins that make up our bodies, and keep in mind there's millions of different kinds of proteins, they each have to be formed in the perfect shape in order to function. If they're the wrong shape, they usually won't work. That's where DNA comes in. DNA does a lot of interesting things, some of which we don't fully understand, but one of its main and most well understood functions is to tell amino acids how to line up and form themselves into the perfect protein shapes. In theory, if the right proteins are built at the right time and in the right place, everything else from cells to organs to entire creatures will come out just fine. This here is a simplified model of DNA. It shows us that the steps of the ladder are made up of 4 different kinds of chemicals shown here by different colors and letters. If you look at just one half of the molecule, you can read its chemical sequence or genetic code from top to bottom, sort of like a book. A single strand of DNA is extremely long, millions of letters long. It spends most of its life coiled up like a noodle, living inside the nucleus or the centerpiece of a cell. Amino acids, however, live outside the nucleus in what's called the cytoplasm. To help DNA interact with the cytoplasm and convert those amino acids into proteins, special chemicals inside the nucleus make partial copies of the DNA code. These partial copies, called RNA, look a lot like DNA, but they're shorter, of course, and they're missing one of their sides. Their small shape and size allows them to fit through tiny pores in the nucleus, out to the cytoplasm, and into the mouth of another particle called a ribosome. Ribosomes are protein-building machines. They read the RNA code 3 letters at a time, suck amino acids out of their surroundings, and stick them together in a chain according to the RNA code. As the chain grows, it bends, it folds, and it sticks to itself to form a perfectly shaped protein. Every 3 letters of the RNA code tell the ribosome which of the 20 different kinds of amino acids should be added next. For example, CAA tells the ribosome to grab a glutamine. AGU tells it to grab a serine, and so on. Once a protein is built, it can then go on to do a number of different things, one of which could be to help form a brand new cell. So to answer the original question, what is DNA? DNA is a molecular blueprint for a living thing. How does it work? DNA creates RNA, RNA creates protein, proteins go on to form life. This entire process, as complicated, as sophisticated, as magical as it might seem, is entirely based in chemistry. It can be studied, it can be understood. I'm John Perry, and that's DNA stated clearly.
And that's God.
That's only God.
Exactly.
There's no other way to look at that one right there.
Mm,
You know, that's a complicated situation and what goes on inside of us continuously, always replicating, duplicating itself to make sure life exists and to make sure that we have unique identities,
mm,
unique identities. And even if we have identical twins, they're not identical.
No different.
They have a unique DNA that identifies them as only them. And
mm.
if you look at it from God's viewpoint, they got a soul that's not like anybody else's
That's
soul.
right.
It's one of a kind. And so man is always trying to create everything and wants to put themselves in place of God. They want to create a human. That's for sure. They're getting close. They're getting close to. They're getting close to. Oh, wait a minute. And I should have moved this person out of the class. Stand by a second. I got you, Doc. I'm coming right to you.